Hi everyone, Michael Britt here. Now, I'm very proud that the Psych Files podcast has been so successful. It passed the 20 million download mark. And a lot of that success is due to my episodes on how you can use proven memory strategies to remember just about anything, from memorizing terms for a test to remembering people's names at a party or a meeting. So I've put all of these episodes into one audio course. Hippos, aliens, and llamas quickly master the tricks to a great memory. And it's available now on avid.fm/memorymaster. All one word. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 319 of the Psych Files. And in this episode, I have an interview that I think is one of the more moving interviews that I've had over the years. It is with Dr. Susan Lewis, and she is the author of a book called From Deep Within, a forensic and clinical psychologist's journey. And so it does seem like there are a lot of television shows about individuals with sometimes vague psychiatric disorders who commit serious crimes. It is a fascinating topic, but what is it really like? Not so much from the outside, but here is a person who, for many years, worked with these individuals who suffer from serious psychiatric disorders. What do we do with those people? How do we help them? And as you'll find out, often we can't help them, or the systems that we have set up to help people like this are simply not the right ones. And for students, if you've ever been interested in the area of forensic psychiatry, psychology, I think you're going to find this particularly revealing. So let's talk with Dr. Susan Lewis, author of From Deep Within, a forensic and clinical psychologist's journey. Let's jump right in with Dr. Susan Lewis. She is the author of a book called Deep Within, a forensic and clinical psychologist's journey. I will put a link in the show notes to the book. Happy to have her on the show today. I'm really, one of the reasons is I've read parts of the book. It's very moving. It's a very different side of forensic psychology. I've talked about forensic psych, and in fact, I had another guest, but we've sort of approached it from some of the research in the area. Whereas yours is you started out, am I correct, as a clinical psychologist?
That's correct.
Right, and then you kind of moved into forensic. So this is a totally different side of forensic psychology, and I think the audience is going to really find this interesting. So can we begin just with a little introduction of yourself?
Sure. Let's see. I got my PhD in the last century. After I got my PhD, I did some working in different settings, and I actually was working on a unit which was called the Dangerous to Manage Unit, which housed, I can't remember if it was 18 or 21 men that were too violent to be housed on another psychiatric unit. And I had been doing some forensic evaluations there and decided that I wanted to do a postdoc in forensic psychology. And so I applied for a postdoc and went to Harvard Mass General Hospital, where I spent a year. And it was quite a fun year. We used to call it serial killer school.
Okay.
After serial killer school, now the question is what I'm going to do. And I had a supervisor there who I thought was very talented, who was a PhD JD. And he suggested that I go to law school. And I thought, well, that's as good an idea as any. Let's see what this is like. So I went on to BU School of Law. And after I graduated, I practiced law, I think, for all of 6 minutes. I went to work at a women's prison in Massachusetts and for a couple of years, and then I went back to work at Mass General Hospital for many years and maintained a private practice, both a forensic practice and a clinical practice.
Okay. And so you have a PhD and a JD then?
Yes, a Juris Doctor. It's in law.
Okay, wow. So you say you started out doing psych evals as a typical clinical psychologist, but it was at a prison?
Well, when I started out, it was a long, long time ago. But after I got my law degree, I went to work in a prison in Massachusetts that was only for women. And I did treatment there. The program was for female sex offenders.
I read in the book that you grew up in Kew Gardens. That is as much a trigger as is the name Kitty Genovese. Have an effect on you?
Well, I think on the morning of the murder, I was very young when I went to school. I think the effect that it had on me was when I was studying in graduate school. There's a whole psychological theory in social psychology called bystander intervention, which was based on the Kitty Genovese murder. And the reporting of what had happened, that nobody called the police and that there were 38 people watching, wasn't true.
Right. When you read it in the textbook or hear about it, you get only whatever can be condensed down into 3 sentences, and like what you just said, the 38 people. And yet I've read a lot saying, okay, wait a minute, it didn't quite happen like that.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think for me it was curious in that way, that the whole theory in social psychology was based on something that was inaccurate.
Mm-hmm. I'm finding that a lot of studies in social psych, because that's my area, is, well, let's see, the Robbers Cave study, for example, which I've talked about previously on the podcast. What's the prisoners study, Zimbardo? They get a certain, they get told a certain way in the textbook, and then things start to come out over time, and it's just like, oh wow, that didn't quite happen like that. Doesn't mean that there isn't something to the idea, and certainly there's a lot to the idea of bystander intervention. But it's better if we get the real story.
I think so. I'm also familiar with bystander intervention. I wouldn't say that it doesn't exist, but I thought it was interesting how the theory came to life.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's turn to your book, because I know our listeners are interested in forensic psychology. Now, your book is a lot of stories about the women that you met in your work, and some of the men as well. And I found each of them to be very moving all by itself. This must have been quite an experience. You decided to devote a chapter to specific people?
I did. The book came to be, I think, to honor my clients, some of them who went through the most horrific experiences. Mm-hmm. They were willing to share it with me and to struggle with it. And some of them got better, or some of them, their lives got richer. And I thought that it would be important to talk a little bit about that, to give a realistic view of what it's like to work with patients that are really ill, and both being as both an evaluator as well as a treater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my wife's a clinical social worker, and so she'll bring home stories. And, if you're not connected with this world, it's hard to imagine the abuse some people have been through in their lives. And your book really brings it out. Sometimes you just, I know I found myself shaking my head and saying, wow, how do you make it through that?
And then come out on the other side and still have a positive attitude. Mm-hmm. Right. That is really the most impressive to me.
All right, so I want to talk about 2 of them in particular, although first let me just ask, so a typical client, I hate to ask this question, what is a typical day like? But if you can give us a little sense of what you do in your work as a forensic psychologist.
Well, it depends on whether I work in the court clinic, or I work in a prison, or I work in a hospital. What I usually am tasked with is doing either competency to stand trial evaluation. If there's some issue where mental illness and the court meet, and there's some uncertainty as to whether the individual can really participate fully in their defense in a courtroom, whether that's affected by mental illness. So it's at the time of the courtroom. The criminal responsibility evaluations that I do are centered at the time of the alleged incident. So the question is, was someone depending on the state that you're in, was someone experiencing mental illness at the time of the alleged crime? And did that interfere in some way with their ability to know the difference between right or wrong, or to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law? It's pretty state specific.
Now, the expression, is this person fit to stand trial, jumps to mind. That's something you see on TV. Is that a good way to say it?
Well, it's competent to stand trial. Competency has to do with a skill set that you would use in a courtroom. Do you understand
What's being
who the
said?
players are, what they do, their responsibilities. Do you know what a defense attorney, a prosecutor does? The different pleadings that you may make. Do you understand the ramifications? And then, of course, can you have a conversation with your attorney so that it is fluid enough so that you can mount the best defense that is in your interest? So it really has to do with what it is that you understand in court, or does mental illness get in the way of that to such an extent that you can't participate in the hearing?
Who is it that first says this person needs a psych eval? Is that the judge?
It's usually one of the attorneys request it. You know, there's a legal part to this as well, which is, for example, let's say that someone has committed a horrific crime. Mr. Holmes in Colorado, who went into the theater that was locked the doors and shot everyone.
Yeah.
There was no question about his activities. Legally, the only defense he might have had was not guilty by reason of insanity. Right. I mean, the evidence was just overwhelming.
Right.
So it's both a legal defense as well as a concern when there's some issues around mental illness.
And I've heard that this plea of
not guilty by reason of insanity.
Yeah, I heard that people think that is given a lot, but the reality is given a little. What is your take on that?
It is used widely. I think that maybe only 1% of the time is it successful. I think part of that is that juries don't want to see someone who is that ill go to a hospital. Then at some later point, whoever the evaluators are make a decision that they are recovered from their mental illness and then are re-released into society, which is what happens. Exactly what happened to John Hinckley.
Oh, he was John Lennon's?
No, John Hinckley shot...
John Lennon?
Who did John Hinckley? No, Ronald...
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan.
Okay.
Is that right?
I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right too.
And what are you saying? That Hinckley, and I'll just Google that. Hinckley had been determined. He used that claim.
Yes, they used the claim of not guilty by reason of insanity, and it was successful.
Oh, so it got a lot of press on that.
Yes, and so he was sent to Walter Reed in Washington.
Yes, that's
okay.
I just Googled it. It's correct. Okay.
Okay. And spent eons there. And of course, eventually what happened was he was very slowly discharged. That happened to be a very high profile case. Mm-hmm. So they had to be careful about what they do. With cases that are not that high profile, someone can be in the hospital for a very limited period of time and then released back into society, which I think is scary for people that don't really know what's going on.
But you're saying this guilty by reason of insanity is very infrequently used.
Yeah, I think it is. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it is because I think that generally it's not successful unless, of course, there's some validity for using it.
So, what you're saying, it reminds me of then, if we can talk about the story of a fictional name, I assume Jay. This was really, this chapter was worth the book for me because it was, I don't know, it shook my head. And the way you ended it, if I may quote from it, is very powerful as well. And so I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about it. Quote here, last couple sentences in this chapter. On the way home, I sobbed. I hated Jay, his lawyer, the legal system, and the hospital for allowing this to happen. I hated my work. Powerful stuff. So tell us about this experience you had with Jay.
Very rarely when you're in court as your forensic evaluator, certainly the defendant is there, but very rarely is the victim there. And in this particular case, the victim was in court. And I heard in great detail how Jay's behavior, what the cost was for her.
So can you tell us about Jay's behavior then? What's his?
Yeah, he would get on a train and fondle women, either underneath their skirts or underneath their coats. And then he would jump off the train. And it got so that he was well known to the police. And he was rotating in and out of forensic hospitals, because what would happen is he would be given medication, stop the medication, and the whole cycle would start again. I did a lot of criminal responsibility evaluations on him, and the hospital did not help him.
I assume the hospital just kept him for a while, got him back on his meds, and then said, "You're out you go."
That's exactly what happened.
And then he would commit another crime of this nature.
Yep. And then he would be involved with the legal system, and the legal system would say, this fellow was mentally ill, let's send him back to a hospital.
So a true revolving door.
A true revolving door. When I saw the victim in court, I felt terrible.
She was
absolutely terrible.
One of the women who he had fondled on the train, and she froze and just didn't know what to do, shocked by the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah. So you met with Jay outside of the courtroom, right, to sit down and do the psych eval?
Yes, I met with him outside of the courtroom. I also met with him when he was in the hospital, in both settings.
So what had happened prior then to your last sentence? On the way home, you sobbed and hated everything.
What happened was that the victim was on the stand and talked about how she had to give up her teaching job because she was afraid to take the train, had developed a phobia about it, that she had given up her apartment, wasn't able to live alone because she had nightmares and was consistently frightened. And the impact on her was, it just destroyed her. She suffered PTSD from it. And there I was on the stand talking about Jay's criminal responsibility at the time, whether or not his mental illness compromised his ability to know right from wrong, then to conform his behavior to the law. And I was saying that the court, of course, has to adjudicate the ruling, but all indications were that at the time of the incident that he was suffering from a severe mental illness, probably best characterized as schizophrenia, and was reacting to the voices that he was hearing in his head rather than to the realistic situation.
The judge passed him off to the hospital, and
the judge then passed him off to the hospital, and I watched her on the stand. She was sobbing and very upset, and as the judge made her ruling, she kind of stood up and said, "That's it?" And I was just very, very touched by it, and I also was very incensed by it. And then afterwards, I met with Jay in an office near the courtroom, and he said to me, "Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I appreciate your work. I'll take my medication, I promise." And I knew that wasn't going to be the case. Yeah. And I felt like a pawn.
So, I have to admit, when I finished the chapter, now I get to talk to the author and ask her. I said to myself, okay, so he's a repeated sex offender. What else can we do? Sending him back to a hospital. And also, can't we send him to a place where he'll be kept a long, long time? And I know that the number of psychiatric hospitals are exceedingly low. I don't know. What were your thoughts? Is there anything else that could have been done other than just sending him back to a hospital?
He would be sent back to a locked forensic hospital where you can stay much longer. You have to have some willingness to participate in treatment.
Are there medications to decrease your testosterone level?
There are. I'm actually going out to Oregon later in the week to talk with a group of individuals that treat sex offenders And, what they're struggling with is people that don't want to come in. How do you treat someone who's not motivated? Mm-hmm. There are some consequences. You're on a registry, depending on how severe the sex offense is. If you move into a neighborhood, everybody in the neighborhood is notified. Mm-hmm. But that's different than treatment.
Okay, so tell us about Kristen. This was another chapter where I was like, wow, I would be scared out of my mind. And I have worked in a psychiatric center. I was only a ward aide. But, I was there when bells would go off and all of the, male attendants were told to go to wherever it was because someone was losing it.
And do something.
Yeah, I'm like, because I'm not a big guy. I'm like, okay, I'll go, but I don't know what I can do. Tell us about Kristen.
She thought that a stranger at store 24 had stolen her children and beat her up, and came to the hospital. And the question certainly was she competent to stand trial because she was delusional, or an evaluation was ordered for criminal responsibility. And she was frightening. She was a very big woman. She would get in your face, and I was scared to death.
Yeah, I bet.
And I was so scared that I didn't want to go into a room alone with her to meet with her. And so I attempted to meet with her in the common area. I thought that would be better. Mm-hmm. When I sat down with her, she asked me who I was. I told her who I was. And she kind of jumped up and said, "Oh, you're trying to steal my children too." And I thought to myself, uh-oh. And so I didn't continue with the evaluation. And what happened is she went to court, and one of the, I don't know what I would call the tenets of the hospital that was moving in that direction was not to use restraint, physical restraint, and medicine if someone was violent.
So they didn't believe in physical restraint. So what do you do when someone loses it?
I guess you run into the bathroom.
Yeah. Wow.
And she was very volatile, was very paranoid. We had been trained in this passive restraint, which did nothing. And she started to act up and attack someone, and the officers came, nurses came, the entire staff came, and nobody could do anything.
Just stand around, really?
Just stand around. The patients were standing against the wall, weeping. Everybody was frightened.
Dear. How long ago was this?
Oh, it wasn't that long ago. Probably like 6 years ago, maybe.
And so is this standard practice to not try to restrain?
Well, I don't know if it's standard practice. I think that I think it protects the hospital.
Oh, I see.
I think that it protects the hospital. Whereas when you work, when I worked on the dangerous to man's unit, it was, they restrained people, but it was very, very different. It was very kind and caring. Someone would be fully restrained, and one of the staff members would sit with them and talk with them or read a book.
Mm-hmm. Wouldn't just throw them into an isolation chamber.
Right. So it wasn't punitive.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And then what happened over time is she went back and forth to the court. And in my opinion, the hospital did not want to keep her because she was so violent. And so they discharged her. And I think they discharged her to a partial hospitalization program, which very slowly she didn't continue with. And they lost track of her. She was also a cocaine addict. And the next thing I heard was I read in the paper that she had murdered someone. And my opinion that was predictable.
But as a forensic psychologist, I mean, there isn't much you can do?
Well, I think it depends on the politics of the hospital. There was another woman who had allegedly murdered her 2 children and was suicidal. So 2 staff members were always with her. There was a competency evaluation, which I did. here's this person who's suicidal, highly suicidal. The administration then wants to make a decision to send her back to prison, where checks are, every 30 minutes? My perception of that was that the hospital didn't want blood on their floor. So, depending on how they make decisions.
Mm-hmm. Jeez. So, I don't live very far from, speaking briefly, of a psychiatric hospital, which was closed in I worked there in the 70s, so it was in the 80s that it was closed down, along with so many others. Of course, under the belief, the assumption that we have medication now, and all we need is community mental health centers. They can come and they go. Do you think that we need to bring back those kinds of psychiatric centers where you stayed there?
I don't know that we need to bring back hospitals. I think that we need to bring back humane treatment where individuals are respected for whatever it is that's going on, that we're trained in listening to them. The medication is simply the biological approach. Can I manage behavior with medicine? But there are a whole lot of other components, I think, to mental illness that we just don't attend to anymore.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There was a woman on where I was working who was a concert pianist who believed that the Messiah was coming. And what she had done was she had been calling area priests to let them know, and going to their residences and interrupting services, and then was sent to the hospital. She was just a lovely human being, just lovely. And so I would go and I would just sit and talk to her and listen to her, not necessarily to her delusions. We don't have the time, or we can't make the time, it seems like, in the hospital settings as they are today. It's push them in, push them out. It's medication. We can't force someone to take medication when they're outside the hospital. And so I think that, certainly biology and medicine is very, very helpful. But the patients are not just their mental illness. They're human beings that usually have been traumatized in some way, that perhaps haven't had the luxuries that some of us might have had when they were growing up.
Yeah, like parents who spent time with us and guided us, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or who didn't abandon us, or some of these individuals are horribly traumatized.
Yeah. As I said, some of the chapters where you describe their pasts was just wow.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. So, and just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, let me ask, how long did it take you to write this book?
3.5 years.
Yeah. And you had to relive these stories, and then a lot of the stories are told in a lot of detail. You talk about what you went to meet someone, and you describe what the room looked like and what the furniture looked like as an insight to that person's mind. What was it like for you to relive all this?
It was very, very difficult. I was surprised at how difficult it was. I felt like I had to go deep inside to myself, both emotionally and in my memory. I almost felt like I was in another world when I was writing it. I had written another book, which was very, very different. So I was surprised, and I had to write it and rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it. And there were many times when I wanted to say, I don't want to do this. This is a silly idea. It was very difficult because I don't think things have changed that much. So what the book says, I hope that I'm wrong, I think still goes on.
All right, so I'll just wrap up with the kind of question that I sometimes ask people who are in the field. I mean, if you are a young person, you're attracted to this, you might be attracted to it because there's stuff you saw on TV. I hope that in listening to this interview, you're like, wow, I guess this is a little bit more challenging a field than maybe I thought. I don't know, how do you get into it if you are intrigued?
Well, you have to go through school, that's for sure. I can only speak to psychologists, but most psychologists are required somewhere along the way to do a clinical placement. A clinical placement in a hospital or in a clinic certainly allows, I think, students to get a more realistic picture of what working in mental health is really about,
Yeah.
and that it's not magical like it is on television, that these are real people that sometimes are scary, need to feel cared about, and need treatment. And money is not there for it right now. So I would certainly do an internship like that rather than watching television. Yeah. I think it presents a more realistic view.
Yeah. Well, Susan, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I'm sure this book was hard to write, but it certainly gave me this peek inside the world that you lived for a long time, and how rough all that was. I mean, but still, it was touching.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about my book and what my book felt like, both to me and to other people.
Well, thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you.
Okay.